Good afternoon, everyone. The first time that I had great wine was when I was at Oxford University. I was invited to a formal wine dinner at Christ Church College, and there was a lot of wine conversation around me, and some of it sounded like this.
This Talbot has a firm skeleton with haunting brambleberry and hedgerow flavours, wouldn't you say?
I find the 1981 slightly vegetal, with a lean body. There's no minerality or nervy backbone. Not a great year for St. Julien Reds. I prefer Margaux. The right bank wines were musty and green with no legs or layers at all.
Now, how many of you actually understood what they were saying? At that time, I felt about 7 years old, even though at the time I was 19. It was because when I was 7, I arrived in the United States not being able to speak a word of English. And it was, listening to this wine talk was exactly like listening to a foreign language. I was thinking about the words like brambleberry. I actually had to go and look it up. Hedgerow. What was skeletal and body and legs doing in wine? It was intriguing, and I was fascinated. And not just that, but it was also the amazing range of flavors that I found in wine. So I was hooked, and as I began my journey, I decided the best way to approach this was exactly like I did with English. Approach it like a foreign language. So the first thing I did was read a lot of books, Hugh Johnson, Jancis Robinson. There were some very good writers out there who had given us the basics of wine, and I realized there was one underlying theme, that actually the world of wine had a language with an alphabet. And the alphabet in the world of wine, the ABCs, are the grape varieties. Now, I'm going to tell you 8 grape varieties that if you know them, you'll actually be able to figure out about 80% of what you find on a typical wine list. For white wines, that's Chardonnay, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, and Pinot Gris. For red wines, it's Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Pinot Noir, and Merlot. Now, if you know the characteristics of these 8 grape varieties, that is your basic alphabet to understanding wine. Then the next step, of course, is building your vocabulary. How do you use this? And you can't actually start using the alphabet until you understand where these grapes express themselves. And the place that they express themselves is what is the building blocks. It's like forming and building your vocabulary, and that's the wine geography. So you take Chardonnay, for example. If you grow it in Chablis, which is one of the coolest regions, it has a very different expression, lower in alcohol, lighter body. The flavor spectrum is more towards citrus, lemon, lime, potentially. Then you put it somewhere warmer, and that same grape variety starts expressing itself in a very different way. Not only that, but if you look at especially European wines, you'll be baffled because they don't tell you, I'm Chardonnay, I am Cabernet Sauvignon. The wine geography gives you the vocabulary to decipher that foreign language that we heard earlier when people were talking about Margaux or Saint-Julien or Gevrey-Chambertin and Burgundy and all these places. This is wine geography. So once you start studying that, you start to have the vocabulary. Now, the final step is actually the fun stage. This is where you go out tasting, drinking, and enjoying wine as much as you can, as widely, as deeply. And what wine actually shows you at that stage is what Kenneth So earlier mentioned about the difference between ability and knowledge. Knowledge is what you have when you learn your wine geography, you learn your grape varieties, but it's actually in building a palate memory. How do all that information that I acquired or that I now understand, how do I apply that and be able to recognize quality, be able to recognize a Chardonnay from Australia that may be different from New Zealand? And it's that ability that you get to when you start really mastering and understanding the world and the language of wine. So what I realized as I was learning more And I took wine learning fairly seriously and read a lot, took a lot of courses, and enrolled in the Wine and Spirits Education Trust and went through that whole academic track. But as wine was becoming a part of my life, I realized that it was changing my life. And there were two ways that it was most impacting my life. It was first my relationship with food and meals, and it was also the way I viewed dining and the whole social interaction. So the first thing that I ended up self-professing was that I became a hedonist. And that's the best way to describe it, because there was nothing to hold me back from actually saying, okay, I am actually going to pursue pleasure as the highest and proper aim of life. And by the way, that is the Oxford definition of hedonism. When you start doing that, you start actually to become more discriminating. You're a little choosy and picky, because at the end, what you end up really going for is what I call palate orgasms. Okay? If you don't believe that they exist, I suggest that you watch a very popular TED Talk by Mary Roach. She has about 16 million views, and she studied orgasms. And there are people out there who can actually rub their knees or rub their eyebrows and achieve orgasm. So why not with your palate by just tantalizing it? And when you do this, and you realize that by being discriminating, you are very selective about how to achieve that palate orgasm. You bring wine into this mix, and wine has its own set of amazing flavors. And you're having flavors work off of each other. There's layers, there's interaction, these flavors become intertwined. And as they say, when food and wine pairing reaches a new level, that's when you actually then get to the level of multiple palate orgasms. And you learn to go slow, and you learn to, as I have over the years, because being a wine professional, I'm always invited to amazing gourmet wine dinners. Often we're served 8 to 10 different amazing wines, and food is also sumptuous and delicious. So you learn to be picky, you learn to be slow. And I think what I realized that after years of aiming, being a self-professed hedonist, aiming for these palate and multiple orgasms, I became someone who had a newfound relationship with food. It's very different from the diets and the fads that you see, where people actually tell you that food is your enemy, calorie is your enemy. No, they're your friend, because that is the source of your pleasure. So that changed my whole perspective. And in 2009, I went on a 12 Asian city book tour. And I was at the time promoting my first book. It was called Asian Palate. And this tour involved pairing local cuisine with about anywhere between 6 to 10 different wines. And at the end of one of the dinners, this was at the Park Hyatt in Seoul, one of the guests of the evening came up to me at the end and said, "Jeannie, that was amazing. I had such a great time. This was, one of the most memorable dinners I've attended." I said, "Fantastic. What did you enjoy most about it?" We did the chili and how it interacts with tannin part, and you've seen how fermented flavors, how it interacts with acidity. What was the most exciting part? He says, "Well, actually that was interesting, but no, I thought it was amazing that it's possible to have a 4-hour Korean meal." As you know, all of our meals, Cantonese, Thai, Singaporean, Korean, we're done usually in less than about 60 minutes. If you're out at lunch, 30 minutes is the norm. I think that I am guilty of it. I can slurp down a bowl of noodles in about 10 minutes flat or less. So we have this habit of eating very, very quickly. And if you look at Europeans, for about 3 years, I was a consultant at Galaxy Macau. You'll see that the dining and eating habits of people were very different. So we had 3 different types of dinners. For the Europeans or Western educated, our wine dinners, where we served between 6 and 8 wines, lasted about 2 to 3 hours, and they were very happy with that. That was the right pace. We had a dinner for overseas educated Chinese or Asians who had a little bit of Western experience. The meal lasted about an hour and a half, but definitely no more than 2. For all the mainland Chinese VIP guests, where we hosted these wine dinners, they had to be in and out in 60 minutes. And you can see that the dining culture is already very, very different. So when you start to look at how does that affect health and how does wine play a role? Well, when you look back about 20 years ago, you'll notice that there were a lot of studies that came out about wine and health. And there was the most famous one that was aired on CBS television station in the United States called 60 Minutes. And they talked about the French paradox. Why was it that the French, who have this diet of very high saturated fats, don't die nearly as much as Americans from heart disease? And the World Health Organization says that the number 1 and number 2 causes of death in the world is coronary heart disease and strokes. And the Americans are dying from this at a huge, very, very, very high rate. And they look at some Europeans. Well, I'm sure you've read about the Mediterranean diet as well. And the conclusion of this French paradox was that actually it was red wine that contributed to their health and longevity and lower risk of heart disease. And subsequently, in the last 20 or so years, there's been numerous studies that support that. And there were actually other studies that actually qualified it and said, no, it's not just the red wine, it's their more active lifestyle, it's the smaller portions, and it's also when you look at the type of fat, okay, it's saturated fat, but it's not trans fat. It's the fat that actually is better for you. So looking at all of that, I think that we can summarize it as actually what most health and medical professionals call the J-curve. And the J-curve is essentially pretty simple. If you abstain and you don't drink any wine or any alcohol, then you have some risk of dying of various coronary diseases. But when you drink a moderate amount, and moderate is defined as 1 to 2 glasses for women and about 2 to 3 for men, then your risk of dying from all these coronary diseases actually drops. But of course, when you go up to occasionally heavy drinking, then it's just sensible that all of your risk for dying increases. So I want to take aside all this health and science and research and take a more practical view of what wine really does in terms of health benefits. And I think that it's pretty simple. What wine adds is that it slows down time. You can't actually enjoy a bottle or a glass of wine without time. There's the whole selection of it. There's the buying of it, the choosing of it, the debating about which one we should drink. But then after that, there's the whole ceremony of wine. And the ceremony is opening the cork, admiring the label, making sure the wine is at the right temperature, having the right glasses. And of course, on the table, it's about refilling. And that whole process allows you to slow down and buy time. And this is in your relationships with your family, with your friends, with business colleagues as well. And if you add a bottle of wine to your table, you'll probably prolong that meal by at least 50%. So wine has both a social as well as a health benefit. After 20 plus years as a wine professional, with this title, MW, Master of Wine, after my name, I really feel like it should not be a Master of Wine, but more mastering wine. Because the world of wine is so vast, so complex, and so rich, that even if I spent the rest of my life studying wine, I would have barely scratched the surface. And I have to remind myself, actually, that I'm an outsider. I don't look the part. I've never grown up in a wine region. I don't have wine making flowing in my veins. And wine was a subject that I ended up studying more as an adult. And so I have to, when I'm visiting, and I'm out there visiting the major wine regions around the world throughout the year, I have to remind myself to be respectful, because I am an outsider. And I have to be open-minded, curious, well, hardworking, but most of all, humble. And it's a subject that does humble you anyway. But through wine, I learned that there is beauty in everyday life, that wine is actually a source of mystery. And great wine really takes several things, but one is the heart of a farmer, someone who cares and really loves the land and cares for the vines and feels one with nature. These are the people who make great wines. But in addition, you have to have the mind of a scientist. You have to know chemistry. You have to know how you're nurturing this grape juice into this amazing product, an amazing beverage. But most of all, most importantly, it takes the soul of an artist. Why an artist? It takes an artist's sensitivity to take what nature gives you, which changes vintage by vintage. You're making about 100 decisions while you're nurturing this product through its end point. And all these little decisions that you take must take into consideration that final masterpiece that you have in your mind. So wine has become an important part of my life. It's changed me. It's taught me that every day you can find beauty and mystery. And I hope that for all of you, wine touches you in the same way. Thank you.